Hi, and welcome to What is This Shift? I'm your host, El Renee, LPN of a decade, and I've been in healthcare for 40 years, but my focus is on long-term care environments such as skilled nursing facilities, assisted livings, memory care, etc., etc. However, even if you're not an LPN or CNA, you are an RN in long-term care, or you are a healthcare worker in any capacity, you are welcome to be a part of this, because I think it's important that people understand the impact that long-term care has on all healthcare and the specific things that we are dealing with that really are kind of a trickle-down effect from other healthcare sectors. And today, I'm going to be talking about what seems to be a universal issue in nursing across the board, regardless of what kind of nurse you are, where you work. This seems to be a very common theme, which is toxic nurse management, to such a degree that it seems to be prevalent. Like it's almost, it's sort of indigenous to nursing. And if you're a CNA or a nurse listening to this and you've ever cried before work, cried after work, dreaded walking into a building, felt physically sick before your shift, questioned your own sanity, or wondered whether you were the problem, you're not alone. There are thousands of healthcare workers experiencing the same things, the same exact things, in facilities all over this country. And maybe the conversation we should be having is not why nurses are leaving or quitting their jobs, but what kind of environments are we expecting nurses to survive in? You'll have to excuse me, please. My allergies, and I've been around a baby with RSV. I've got a cold, and I've had a hell of a week. Basically, due to this topic, believe it or not, the irony. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not the top of my game today, but when a plant doesn't grow, we don't blame the plant. We look to its environment. We look at the soil. Is it getting enough water? Is it getting enough sun? Is the soil that it's in, is it okay? Or is it contaminated? Does it need fertilizer? So we don't blame the plant's inability to grow. But yet when a nurse is in an environment where they can't professionally grow, and their ability to really do their job effectively seems stunted, we blame them and not the environment they're in. And the environment is often crafted by the management. There's actually an entire body of nursing research around toxic leadership. And one of the things that stands out is this, that a toxic nurse manager usually doesn't destroy a unit overnight. They create an environment where stress, fear, favoritism, and silence become normalized. Now I'm going to keep talking about this. Last week I talked about the relationship between LPNs and CNAs, and I briefly touched upon it. And most of these beginning episodes I'm doing is just laying a foundation. And these subjects are going to be revisited and gone into further depth because they're very important and because there's a lot of layers to it. You really can't cover it all in, an hour-long podcast. But it definitely, these are the issues that we're facing. And in long-term care especially, the toxic nurse management can become the whole culture of the building, and it spreads to every other department. And when this happens, nurses and CNAs and everybody else that's working around these people, they often experience symptoms similar to workplace trauma. Nurses in toxic environments describe dread before the shifts, insomnia before work, hypervigilance while on the job, looking over their shoulders, paranoid to make a mistake, crying in their cars, GI symptoms, panic attacks, emotional numbness, depersonalization, drug and alcohol abuse after work, problems in their interpersonal relationships, inability to self-care. The list goes on and on. When you're being traumatized and you're being abused on the job, especially when it's subtle and you can't quite put your finger on it, you can't tangibly prove it, but you know it's happening because you're being consistently gaslit, it manifests like this, migraines, stomach upset, and then of course it's very difficult to get your shifts covered, much less calling into work. That's a whole different episode. And a lot of nurses just think to themselves, well, maybe I'm just weak, right? Now, I want to say that the opinions that I'm expressing here are strictly my own and do not reflect any past, present, or current employer, and they do not reflect any necessarily past, present, or current, people that I've worked with, although I do have stories. I have seen a lot. And you all have stories. And the internet is a wonderful basket of stories, if you will. And this is universally happening. I also want to say, because I know that there's probably some nurse managers who may be tuning in, who are very defensive and waiting to pounce and to disagree. And yes, do I sound like I'm generalizing and labeling them all toxic? Yeah, it sounds like that. I do take responsibility for that. And I am sorry if it comes across as everybody. Of course, it's not everybody. There are some very decent directors of nursing. In fact, I just recently met one online who I've been messaging with, and hopefully I can even get her on this podcast. And she teaches other directors of nursing how to be really effective and bring their team together and all of that. But for every one director of nursing like her, there's about 20 that are ineffective and are toxic. And that does seem to be, there just seems to be too many. Like it's not an anomaly. It's not an exception to the rule. It's kind of a given that you're going to find this in long-term care. So, these chronic hostile work environments genuinely affect our nervous systems. Okay. So while you may not be that nurse manager that's toxic, maybe you're the nurse manager who decided that you wanted to make a difference. And because you have been affected by ineffective management, you want to be the change you wish to see. And so you get into management in hopes to help your fellow nurse and be that manager you wish you had. And that's a wonderful, idealistic reason to get involved. Unfortunately, you find out that you're not there to manage the nurses. You're not there to make their lives better. You're there to cater to what corporate needs and to make their money better. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the directors of nursing and the assistant directors of nursing and even the unit managers, they get in there and they think, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to start staffing and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And guess what? They're not allowed to. It doesn't work out. Well, I'm not going to let these inappropriately people be admitted into our facility. They are not appropriate for this memory care or this assisted living. Corporate's going to tell you we don't care what you think. I mean, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to admit them anyway. So there's a lot on the plates of the managers. I will give you that, and I'll get there. But unfortunately, those of you who are what I call disordered, let's just say dysfunctional at best, have ruined it for the good ones, okay? Because when you're bad, you're super bad. And that seems to supersede any good management that's out there. And I've literally seen good managers have a following. Like nurses will leave a facility and quit when that nurse moves on. They will follow that nurse and go work wherever that nurse is going because they love that manager so much. And that's how kind of traumatized we are. We don't want anybody else. Once we find a good one, we don't ever want to let go. It's like finding a good hairdresser, like you're going to follow them to the next salon. But anyway, healthcare culture often minimizes the hostile work environments and the negative effects it has on healthcare workers. Toxic nurse managers often seem to have things in common. Researchers and nurses repeatedly describe patterns like emotional validity, favoritism, public humiliation, passive-aggressive communication, inconsistent discipline. One nurse gets written up for something seemingly sort of petty compared to a grievance that, another nurse got away with. I can cite a perfect example. There was a nurse who, for reasons unbeknownst to anyone, two nurses actually, who a medication arrived for a patient, resident, and that medication ended up in the room of somebody else. And the nurses were giving it. And not just one time, but for a couple of days in a row. And nothing was done. But then there was another nurse who had been accused of not giving a pain medication to someone who got suspended. So as you can see that there can be some inconsistencies when it comes to, enforcing specific policies and procedures. There can be retaliatory behavior. There can be lack of accountability upward. And managers it's not their fault. And they typically pass the buck to, it's corporate, or it's this, it's that, it's not them. Typically, it's their coworker. Like, for example, the director of nursing will blame the assistant director of nursing. Inconsistent discipline, like I talked about. Scapegoating the staff. There's usually always one person. Like, okay, here's another example. I said I wasn't going to get too much into personal stories, but a nurse had received a narcotic delivery and left it on the nursing cart. And the next day, apparently it was gone, right? Now, I hadn't been at work in a couple of days. All I know is that it was received during the week, like on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. I arrived to work to give that medication on a Saturday. Couldn't find it. Like, it was missing. The whole bottle was missing. And there was an investigation. I had to talk to the police and all the things. But there was a nurse who had recently started working there who quit. Not really related to that. She quit for other reasons, but she quit at the same time. So, of course, everybody, she must have been the one to take it, because look at her. She ran off and quit. With absolutely no evidence that that's the case. But it's just assumed because she disappeared, she must be the culprit, which, hey, she took it. So, sure, that happened. So now this nurse has been, blacklisted in the community as a nurse that potentially stole a whole bottle of narcotics, which is not a fair accusation against a nurse by any means. That can cost somebody a license and criminal liability. So that's not something to play with. And those accusations should not be made lightly. And of course, intimidation disguised as professionalism, micromanagement. I have a number of stories related to that. One that really stands out to me, I was in the middle of a med pass, and a nurse manager signed into my EMR and literally asked me why medication hadn't been checked off yet, and lied to me and told me that corporate wanted to know. And I was supposed to believe that the corporate nurse was remote viewing my EMR at 8:30 in the morning, wanting to know why I didn't give a thyroid medication at 6 a.m. Because it hadn't been given yet. I was still in the middle of med pass, and that time had not been changed on the EMAR. We didn't have a nurse there at 6 a.m. So it was it was like, but wait, what? You know, I'm in the middle of med pass. You're texting me to wondering why I didn't click off on a. So that's very micromanaging ish. A lot of nurses say that the hardest part of our job isn't the workload. It's never knowing what version of a manager we're walking into. You know, some of these managers, they have, you know, alter egos and multiple personalities, and you don't know who you're talking to from day to day. Workplace bullying and incivility is extremely common in nursing. A large systematic review and meta-analysis found that 55.1% of nurses experienced workplace incivility at some point in their career. Another review found that bullying prevalence among nurses ranging from 26% to 77%, depending on the setting and definition. And I've told you guys this a couple of times. I'll mention it again. I will have an expert coming on so we can talk about nurse bullying, period. Because, of course, toxic management is a part of that. But nurse-on-nurse crime is big. Nurse bullying is a huge problem. And it's been ignored by the system, and it's actually been encouraged, silently encouraged. They want us to be attacking each other. But that 77%, that means in some facilities bullying is not rare. It's been normalized, and it's been, that's just part of it. That same review found that verbal abuse prevalence exceeded 61%. I just recently had a run-in with a higher up, and it was very unhinged, very unprofessional. And, she was coming at me as if we were two chicks in a bar having an argument over a man. It was a lot of gaslighting communication. Well, if you're so unhappy, why don't you quit? Which is giving, you don't like this country, why don't you leave? It's giving being in a toxic relationship, and you tell that person, hey, you really hurt my feelings, or you really let me down. And they're like, well, if I'm such an asshole, why are you still with me? That it's narcissistic communication for sure, but it definitely is devaluing, and it's also, it's just meant to throw you off. Because the two things are not mutually exclusive. You can enjoy being a nurse, and you can enjoy what you do, and you can love your residents, but you can also point out what's not right at your workplace. And that's okay. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be a nurse anymore. So I've seen that a lot too from the general public when nurses start talking about, our description of what we go through on the job, and people will say, well, why don't you just quit being a nurse? Well, why should we have to? Why? Why should we have to be the ones to leave? Why don't they change? And, so toxic leadership directly predicts a toxic culture, a toxic work environment in general. A 2025 leadership study found that narcissistic leadership behavior sends a message to nurses that management creates a toxic work environment, the bullying is tolerated, turnover becomes more likely. And that's kind of huge because it shifts the conversation from problem employees to problem leadership cultures. But many don't want to recognize that. Sometimes toxic managers, we give them a lot of credit by thinking that they're like masterminds and really malevolent and brilliantly, thinking of ways to target individual nurses. No, more likely, they're just emotionally reactive people who tend to split staff into either good or bad categories. They vent impulsively. They do play favorites, and sometimes very inconsistently. They say things that they shouldn't. They talk about people that they shouldn't be talking about, and they manage based on emotion rather than stability. But the effect on that and the effect on staff, things can feel very targeted regardless. People don't feel secure. Management comments about staff to other staff, which is highly inappropriate. Approval feels conditional as a result. Emotional politics are bleeding into the operations. And nurses are constantly reading between the lines and trying to feel out their manager's mood. I learned my lesson the hard way when I had a nurse manager who I don't know whether she was just lacking professionalism, lacking leadership skills, or if she was really narcissistic. I don't know. But she tended to befriend us. My expectations for managers are different than they are for my fellow coworkers on the floor. I have higher expectations and standards for management, okay? So I don't think that they should be sitting around talking about their personal life drama or talking about other coworkers or other nurses that they're having issues with, or that, what they find problematic about another nurse. All of that is not okay. And you're kind of stunned, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. Because if people talk to you, they will talk about you 99% of the time, right? So when she says, well, I shouldn't be saying this, but, and then don't tell anybody, but, it's kind of like that whole love bombing thing where, you're made to feel like you're special enough and she trusts you enough to impart this information to you that she knows she could get in trouble for doing, right? Hold on a second. Man. Excuse me. Oof. I'm going to put a cough drop in my mouth. You think that you're kind of friendly, so your armor sort of drops, and you're not dealing with them anymore like a manager versus a floor nurse. Now it's kind of like we're work buddies, and you let your guard down and you feel comfortable enough to kind of vent and rant to that person, especially because she was ranting about things going on with her position and how her supervisors are making her feel. So you feel this kind of kinship. Well, my fatal mistake was thinking that was the case with her, and clearly it wasn't. Long story short, it wasn't. So I learned the hard way that I was being manipulated and positioned into a situation that I didn't really want to be in, but I was used as an instrument to validate her. Long story short. And this kind of environment wears people down psychologically over time, especially people who are highly observant and emotionally attuned to tone and power dynamics. And if you have any sort of history in your life of dealing with very toxic people or being abused in any way, you're very triggered by all of this, right? So especially in a narcissistic workplace dynamic with a narcissistic manager or a whole clique, right? There's often a cycle. There is that idealization. You're valued because you work hard, you pick up shifts all the time, you stay later, you solve problems, you take responsibility, you speak up, you carry the unit, you're their eyes and ears, and you mentor the others. You're willing to do all the training and all the precepting for new orientation people. But then it's a threat perception. Eventually your competence, your honesty, your independence, or your refusal to play politics becomes threatening, because maybe you're going to one-up them. They see you as a threat, even if you want nothing to do with their position or anything involving management. Now you're a perceived threat, and you didn't do anything. You're just being you. And so then the devaluation comes. Suddenly you're difficult, you're negative, you're dramatic, you're no longer a team player, you're too emotional, You're always complaining, even if the underlying issues you are raising are completely spot on and valid and real. So then the isolation will start. These managers will get they play their favorites. They get their little flying monkeys to appear, right? So they get their favorites to kind of probe and ask you questions. Information gets withheld. They gatekeep pertinent information, say like about an admission coming or what a family member is expecting. You're constantly being surprised. And this only hurts the residents, but it also makes you look incompetent. Your mistakes are magnified while others' mistakes are minimized or like overlooked entirely. And you start questioning yourself. Like maybe you are the problem. And then the replacements and the scapegoating. The system quietly shifts the blame onto the person who points out any dysfunction instead of addressing the dysfunction itself. So the people who point out problems now are labeled the problem. And the isolation is really real. I had a situation where, there were 2 nurses on duty, and one of the nurses, she was the favorite of the director of nursing. She would go sit with the director of nursing upstairs in the office, leaving me alone for like half of this 12-hour shift. And I mean, that's fine. I don't need somebody to hold my hand. It's cool. But it was just like so obvious. Like, really? In many respects, nursing is revisiting high school dynamics. The popular girls are the favorites and their teacher's pet, right? They get all of the best assignments. They're on the best hallways. They never have to be, like, let's say it's an assisted living. They never have to be in the assisted living side or the memory care side. So they're always in the side that they prefer. They always get their PTO. They always get their days off that they request. Everything's accommodated for them. They're often praised. They're given Employee of the Month. They're giving Nurse of the Year. All of these different things. Daisy Awards if they're an RN in a hospital. And all of the other nurses who don't, what I call dick ride the DON, they don't get any praise or recognition at all. You'll also notice in a narcissistic nursing environment, there's very little praise. There's very little positive reinforcement, very little involvement. Like, hey guys, thanks for like doing this and you guys rock and blah, blah, blah. Like there's no consistency to that. It's sprinkled here and there. Nurses Week, you may not even get stuff from the actual DON or the actual facility you're in. You may get it from outside sources like, a DME company, right? So, getting positive recognition and positive reinforcement, you get breadcrumbed. So when you do get like the occasional accolade or pat, attaboy, you finally get that little pat on the back. You're like, oh my God. It's like being starved, right? I've talked about that before. And then somebody throws you something, really that's not edible, but you're so hungry, you'll take it. So, the narcissistic systems will protect the appearance over reality. Like they want to appear like, hey, I'm a great manager and all my nurses are really happy and they all love me. When in reality, we're all sitting here like going, what the fuck, behind their back. And healthcare environments are especially fertile for this because the hierarchy matters. Healthcare has made a big deal out of the hierarchy. Staffing shortages create chronic stress. Burned out workers stop speaking up. Management often prioritizes the optics and the state coming in and the surveys and the CMS ratings and the liability over anybody's happiness. People who document problems become the problem. Gossip becomes social currency. And exhausted staff are just easier to manipulate. A lot of targets, and excuse the cough drop in my mouth now. My nose is running too. I'm telling you, I hate being on camera. So like YouTube doesn't work for that. And I don't have the podcaster voice, but regardless. And nobody reads books anymore. That I can do. But a lot of targets of workplace narcissists are actually very highly conscientious people. They're not perfect people. None of us are. But, the nurse that notices inconsistency and asks questions and advocates, some might say a little bit too loudly, or refuses to blindly worship the authority, or the nurse that keeps receipts, who documents everything. The psychological effect is nasty because it creates cognitive dissonance in that nurse. These nurses, these good nurses who actually give a shit about what they're doing, not just there for a paycheck. They know what they're seeing is real, but why are they being treated like they're crazy? One estimate found that workplace turnover, which causes a loss of productivity and absenteeism due to just not being able to go in, related to lateral violence and emotional violence, if you will, sometimes physical, cost healthcare over $4 billion annually. So toxic management isn't just emotionally damaging, it's financially destructive too. A multi-state ombudsman survey found that a fear of retaliation in nursing homes in particular, it was widespread, reported across many states, and often related to staffing and care concerns. Toxic cultures affect patient care. This is a given. The research repeatedly links bullying and toxic work environments to worse teamwork, communication breakdowns. I have a manager who, like I was saying earlier, gatekeeps information. I don't know whether she's just overwhelmed and has no memory and is just like got too many irons in the fire, juggling too many pins up in the air. I don't know, but she is forever forgetting to communicate things. And she just doesn't tell us things that we as the nurses on duty should know. So I really don't know if she's just really ineffective at her job, completely overwhelmed and unwilling to admit defeat, isn't getting help, if she's getting bullied, I don't know. Or if maybe she just needs to be the fountain of knowledge and she loves the fact that we all have to go to her and ask her about stuff that should be volunteered. So I don't know, but this increases the chances of making errors. And this does contribute to poor patient outcomes, resident outcomes. If things aren't communicated correctly, a resident may go without a medication for a couple more days than they should. That's negligence. So why does toxic management survive if we're all aware of it and we're all like hating it? And this is, toxic managers are often protected because turnover is normalized, right? Nurses quitting, coming and going all the time. I mean, I remember when I was first a nurse, I really was worried about not having a reference if I didn't give a 2-week notice and I left a job abruptly and I really, wanted to make sure my resume was clean. Nobody cares. Like, if you go to a nursing interview, if you have a heartbeat, a pulse, and your background's clean and your license is good, you're hired. I mean, nobody even checks references anymore. And that's neither good or bad, but it's just the turnover's been normalized. It's not like other jobs where you really need to worry about, am I going to have a reference when this is over, or I should stay at least 6 months, or otherwise it's going to look bad on my resume. Nursing's not working like that anymore. The staffing shortages are severe. And they're severe because nurses are done with this shit. We're done dealing with this shit. Period. There's plenty of nurses. We're just done being treated this way. Administrators fear instability, but the complaints are fragmented. Nurses are exhausted. HR protects liability, not morale. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but if not, you're hearing it here first. HR is not for you. Human resources is not for the employee. Now, they love to market it as such, and they've always made the employee feel like, if you're really having issues on the job, we've got you. we've got your back. We will protect you. We will make sure that, you're not. No, HR is there to protect the company. They want to make sure that they're not going to get their asses sued. They want to make sure that they're not going to get bad press. That you're not going to run to the internet and run and tell that and give 1 star. I mean, it's really, if you go on Glassdoor or Indeed or any site, Google reviews, any site where employees are able to rate and leave reviews for their job. Now, of course, it's going to be like this for any area in life that people can go and leave reviews. You're typically going to get the worst or you're going to get the best. Talked about this before. Mediocre, mundane things that are not memorable, people don't even bother. But if it's really, if people remember things that are really emotionally charged, good or bad, right? So I don't care where you're looking to work, healthcare entities across the board consistently are 2 maybe 3 stars for the best ones. The vast majority of employees are not only miserable at their jobs, but it's the same complaint everywhere. And toxic management and leadership and CEO type stuff, administrator type stuff, probably the number one reason. And that leads me back to what I've said before, which is people don't quit nursing, people quit management. And that's true anywhere. People don't quit jobs, they quit their boss 98% of the time. So HR doesn't care. HR just wants to know, what are the chances of this person, turning around and suing us? Like, risk management is what HR really should be called. HR is there to explain the shitty benefits that they offer you, and make sure that you are clocking in 7 minutes before or not 7 minutes after the hour. I mean, let's face it, HR, it ain't for us. And, high performers are tolerated if the metrics look okay, meaning that if a director of nursing or administrator, hits the metrics that the corporate higher up people want, that is going to please the investors, then they're tolerated. Even if they treat the little people, us piss ants on the floor, on the front lines, like shit, it's okay because they're producing. So somebody can be emotionally destructive for years if they stick around at the job, and staffing barely survives. The survey outcomes stay acceptable, admissions continue, and labor costs stay controlled. And that's very uncomfortable and true in healthcare. The cycle of toxicity that nurses talk about constantly, you'll hear this over and over again online, is that the good staff, the good CNAs, the good nurses, the good social workers, everybody good, right? Meaning has empathy, is there for the resident, who cares about the resident's well-being, who puts themselves in their shoes. If this was me or my loved one, how would I want to be treated? Those nurses, the nurses who care about, the morality and the ethics of things, who know right from wrong, and who are also advocating for themselves, not being abused, and protecting their licenses. And that's a tall order to do all that. It is. Doing the right thing is never the easiest thing. And it's often the most exhausting and the least rewarding, but you can sleep at night knowing that you tried, right? But, good staff speaks up, then management labels them as difficult, then the good staff just quit. They leave. Okay, fine, fuck you. I don't need this. And, even a couple of years ago, you could easily find a job 5 minutes later. Now, the market's looking a little weird because of everything else going on in the world. Imagine that. So it's not as quick. Instead of 5 minutes now, it might be, 5 days. But instead of staying and fighting the system, people are just like, fuck it, I'm just going to find another job. And then it starts all over again. And if you're like me, you realize, damn, it's like this everywhere. Doesn't matter where you go. But they quit. Some quit nursing for good. The remaining staff, they see that what just happened and they become quieter. They silently start looking. They become sort of passive aggressive. They talk about the manager behind their back, but they don't go report the manager to anybody else. And they just keep their head down and do their job. And they don't back up that other nurse. They don't say, hey, you know what? That nurse was right, by the way. They don't want that smoke. They don't want that trouble because maybe they're not ready to leave. There's a lot of reasons why people just don't up and quit. And I don't fault people for that. We all have to make a living, especially now in this economy. But the culture will worsen as a result of this because the management gets away with it. And new staff arrives, naive and hopeful, because they just left a gig that was terrible, right? They just left a toxic culture. So they're thinking maybe there's some, a reprieve here, a respite here, and no, the cycle repeats. And eventually the building may or may not develop a reputation amongst other nurses. I mean, nurses network. I have a group of nurses that I network with that's all I talk to them about. Like, we might send a text, Merry Christmas, or hey, congratulations, let me see a picture of the baby type of thing. But basically, we check in with each other easily every 3 to 6 months. Like, hey, are you still at so-and-so? Yes, I still am, but I'm looking. Where are you? Well, I'm here now. Or no, I left there and I'm here now. And, how is it? And, well, I wouldn't advise it. Like, nurses talk and places get reputations. And nurses are told, don't work there. And so you typically see those places being advertised a lot on the apps for agency coverage. Okay. But yeah, buildings get reputations. And then it leaks out into the general public. And they will be all over Facebook groups saying, don't put your mom in this. Don't put your grandpa there, So, yeah, I mean, that's the only power we have is the passive aggressive power to just tell other people in our lives. But that's not stopping it. What stops it is when you cost them money. But that's another episode. But every long-term care worker knows which buildings are really problematic and which ones are, tolerable. Now, here's an interesting angle. A lot of places, and I see this more in assisted livings than I have in skilled, nurses become managers without any leadership training. Very often, a assisted living will get rid of the management, or the management quits, and then there's this huge gap in needing management. And usually the staff nurses kind of have to act as the interim, right? So, and that's when you get sales and marketing going on assessments, and the regional nurses will just sign off on it. And so you get these really inappropriate for assisted living type of people in there. And, there's no nurse management. So the floor nurses kind of hold it down and they kind of take care of everything. And actually, I've seen in some environments where it's been better that way. And then you get management that comes in there and like they upset that chi, and like the whole feng shui of the place is completely askewed and it's not good anymore. So, the thing is that a lot of places, because of that gap, become desperate and they immediately go and want to hire internally. So they approach their floor nurses and they're like, hey, anybody want to do this job? And I mean, listen, a nurse can be clinically excellent. They can be hardworking. They can be organized, but end up being a terrible leader. And especially, and I'm going to sound like I'm throwing my own kind under a bus. Us licensed practical nurses, we are not trained, nor are we educated in nurse management and nurse leadership. That's an RN thing, especially a BSN thing. That's where they learn leadership skills, management, organizational, protocols and procedures and all of that stuff. LPNs, we don't learn that, right? We are the blue collar of nurses, and we're just all about the grind, the hands-on taking care of people. We're not learning all that stuff. We're not learning the care planning. Yes, we learn how to do care plans. We have to do care plans in nursing school. And we may update them in an assisted living environment, but we do not do initial care plans. We should not be doing initial assessments. And really, most places have their director of nursing, their RNs, for this reason. So when you have an LPN just pulled up off the floor and offered a couple more bucks and said, be a leader, be a manager, it hasn't, in my opinion, worked out very well. The nurse leaders that I have seen, the managers that I've seen that have been LPNs, and I've worked with quite a few, are not as effective as the RNs. And I'm just being honest, and that is totally anecdotal. I'm not saying that there aren't LPNs that are really good at it. I just haven't worked with those LPNs. Because some of these places, these communities and facilities often promote people based on seniority, their availability, and their endurance, not emotional intelligence or leadership ability. So then you end up with burnt out managers managing burnt out staff because they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. It creates a cascading dysfunction as a result. And it can also create blurred boundary issues, managers oversharing personal drama, staff feeling emotional close to the leadership, like we are floor nurses working together in the trenches, but then suddenly get burned when the power dynamic reappears. And this is why nurses need boundary with management, even when management is acting like, we're friends, right? Other kinds of nurse managers, there's the management that only seems to care when state's coming, right? That's a common complaint in long-term care. Nurses will describe suddenly getting extra staff only during, state in building or survey week, and management panicking about appearances instead of fixing chronic problems. Like, get that Stanley out of the nurses station. No water at the nurses station. Pressure to make things look good, cosmetic fixes instead of real staffing issues. But it begs the question, if staffing can magically improve when state's in the building, then staffing really isn't an impossible problem to fix, right? Staffing is going to be a whole episode in and of itself. There's the manager that retaliates against outspoken nurses, a huge recurring theme. Nurses getting targeted after reporting safety concerns, suddenly being written up more often, suddenly being micromanaged and scrutinized and their work being watched. They're suddenly being labeled as negative. If you're so unhappy, why don't you quit? Losing preferred assignments. You know what, we need you over here now. You get thrown on the worst hallway, or on a hallway you're completely unfamiliar with. Being isolated socially by management. I told you about the nurse sitting upstairs and I'm alone the whole time, which would give the impression of kind of being ganged up, like not necessarily being ganged up on, but being excluded. You're not part of the cool club, One CNA described it as being gaslit, scapegoated, lied to, and gossiped about constantly. Another one said that they had to block a former supervisor after quitting because of continued harassment. I mean, it didn't end just because that person quit. And I've seen that. I've seen people, leave a place and then all of a sudden their social media is flooded with comments by, newly created accounts. And, that's an actual thing, right? Healthcare is fear-based, and this is huge. And so in toxic facilities, a lot of nurses stop asking questions. They just kind of accepted that this shit is as it is. It is what it is. Staff hides their mistakes. They don't report med errors. They don't, they hide a lot. CNAs stop reporting concerns. The nurses and the CNAs begin to turn on each other. They begin to be petty about things that they don't need to be petty about. A lot of infighting and bickering, Why am I getting this vital sign of 123/24? Why didn't you come tell me this? You know that this is not a normal parameter. The CNA is like, well, why don't you do your own damn vitals then? Both of them have a point. But whose fault is it that nobody can get the vitals, in a good period of time, or like everybody's so hurried that she actually meant to put the respirations that were at 24 and yes, should have reported that. Regardless, it's a setup for failure in so many ways, and we're meant to be pitted against each other and blame each other for that. And research in patient safety repeatedly shows that fear cultures increase the risk of all kinds of errors because people become afraid to speak up. And everybody works in self-protection mode. It's gotten so bad that CNAs are even heard saying, I got to protect my license. And we know that they don't have a license, but they are saying the same thing nurses are. Oh, no, I'm not risking my license. Nope. Nope. It is not worth losing my license over. So that has had a trickle-down effect to CNAs. And yes, toxic managers often reward silence and not competence. A lot of nurses talk about this too, that people in management, they don't always like the safest nurse, the most ethical nurse, or the hardest worker. Sometimes they're into the ones that are the least confrontational, who are socially loyal, who are willing to overlook the problems or go right along with the DON and blame somebody else, and willing to just go along with the flow. And the outspoken nurses get labeled difficult, negative, dramatic, not a team player, like I said before. And this creates moral injury in the good nurses. And long-term care has unique pressures that can worsen toxic management, unlike many hospital units, because long-term care leadership deals with chronic understaffing, the whole Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement pressures, the CMS stuff, the documentation, the survey fears, the family complaints, the fighting off the public perception. I've spoken before about walking into a resident's room in the afternoon and their TV is blaring, do you have a loved one in a nursing home? Are they being abused? And, it's some attorney group basically telling the public, look for reasons to sue. Long-term leadership is dealing with impossible labor budgets, corporate metrics, constant admissions and discharges, and staffing agency cost, because when you start getting regular staff leaving all the time, you got to fill in the blanks, and so they have to utilize agency nurses. Some managers handle that pressure very well, but others displace that pressure downward onto the staff. So instead of everybody saying, hey, this system is broken, the message becomes, hey, you as the nurse, you're not working hard enough. And that distinction matters. Because burnout culture, boundary problems, understaffing, and the leadership promoted out of desperation, and managers emotionally overwhelmed themselves. The whole kind of unspoken don't bring me problems culture, scapegoating outspoken staff, and how good nurses then become paranoid and hypervigilant because systems fail. Another interesting archetype is the martyr manager. That's the manager who constantly reminds staff how much they sacrifice. I'm sure you know that manager. I had to stay late. I was here till 10 o'clock last night. And their salary, and we all know their salary. And because their salary, they're not getting any overtime for staying past the 8-hour shift that they're usually working. One of the biggest complaints is that nurse managers never want to get on the floor. Now, to be fair, I did see a DON in Chicago, at a nursing home in Chicago, and she was always on the floor. She was always working the floor. She didn't mind. And that was her choice. She didn't have to. She could have had agency in there, and maybe she did it to mitigate the cost of agency, because it kept her labor down. It kept her budget, and maybe she would get a bonus for that. I don't know. But all I know is that she was willing to be on the floor. A big, huge complaint is that many of them are not. And a lot of them, when they are, will make a big, huge fucking deal out of it, right? They'll be like, I was on the floor yesterday and I still have to do my job too. And it's like, listen, man, did they not go over the job requirements? Because you are expected to be on the floor sometimes if you cannot, cover your staff. This is why, as nurses, when we try to call off, it's a huge fucking ordeal, and we know it is. And again, that warrants its own episode. But they don't want to be on the floor so badly that they will bully us into not calling in and coming in working sick. But they use this guilt as leadership. Well, we had a call off. Can you work? No, I really can't. Really? Because, didn't she work for you a couple weeks ago? Well, yeah. Yeah, be a team player. They frame boundaries as selfishness. Like if you put a boundary down, you are being selfish. Like you're not giving to the team. You're not being a team player. You're not taking care of your fellow nurses. You're not taking one for the team. They expect unlimited flexibility. So, for example, if you're a PRN nurse and you've already put in like 100 hours for the pay period, they will still call you at the last minute and be like, yeah, can you work? And you're like, I'm PRN, I'm not on call. There's a big difference. Like, just because I'm PRN, I don't have that level of flexibility. I'm not available at the last minute. PRN means that you've got holes in your schedule, and if I'm available to pick those up, I will. But don't call me because somebody called off and you need coverage at 11 p.m. tonight, and it's 9 p.m. now. Like, get the fuck out of here. Or you call me at 5 o'clock in the morning and you need somebody to come in at 7. Like, I don't blame you for trying, but what makes you think that, like, that's even remotely okay? Like, no. Sorry. You should have called me. If we have to call in how many hours before we're expected to be there, they need to give us that same courtesy of like, here. But no, that doesn't happen. So they, and they equate our exhaustion or their exhaustion with dedication. Like you're really a great nurse if you stay later. And you're doing all these things and you're going above and beyond. But then you get yelled at if, like, why do you have so much overtime? Why is it taking you, 5 hours to do an admission, right? So it's like, well, they want us to do all of these extra things on top of what we're already doing, but you better do it within an 8.5 hour period. Otherwise, you're going to be questioned. But they, we all know that martyr nurse too. Right? Like, I just worked 12 hours in a row and now they asked me to pick up tomorrow for an 8. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm so tired, but like, yeah, I guess. I just don't understand what's going on around here. But then they'll do it. But like, look at me. I sacrifice so much. Instead of simply saying, yeah, no, I can't. Sorry. The managers make their staffing issues our problem. So you'll hear the stuff like, I worked 18 hours. Or you hear the managers, nobody wants to work anymore. That's a big one coming from like boomer. And I'm a Gen Xer, but like a boomer manager will be like, these younger nurses and CNAs, they don't want to work anymore. Or back in my day, nurses did this. And it's like, okay, they also smoked behind the nurses' station. Should we bring that back? Like, or we all have to pull together. No, we really don't. But staff starts feeling like, if we rest, we're lazy. Saying no is a betrayal. Burnout is weakness. If we have a legitimate reason to be off, like somebody died and we want to go to a funeral, that we literally have to barter our hours and be like, hey, I will work your shift if you can cover this part of my shift. Like, instead of being like, nah, I'm entitled to bereavement. I'm taking the whole day. Figure it out. Not my problem. And this mentality is deeply embedded in our nursing culture. And the residents can feel this. They can feel when staff morale is broken, and the families can feel it too. And then the managers leave. They either quit or they're fired. DONs rarely stay long. Now, I have a bunch of statistics that I want to go over about this. I want to talk about what happens when the DONs change constantly and what staff often experiences as a result. And what happens when the interim DON enters the building. And why these conflicts seem to happen in long-term care specifically. And what happens when there's conflicts between the director of nursing and the assistant director of nursing, or the director of nursing and the administrator, or the director of nursing and the sales and marketing team. When these cross-departmental people are beefing, if you will, and how that affects us, and what bedside staff often sees when leadership is divided, and this split leadership culture. I want to talk more about triangulation in management. So I'm going to have to do an episode part 2, because this has already been an hour long. This is a lot to unpack. And, it's hitting me particularly hard this week because I'm actually actively involved in a culture that is not healthy, right? At the end of the day, long-term care doesn't need more inspirational posters about teamwork. We need emotionally intelligent leadership. So I'm going to continue this topic in my next episode. And, I think it's important to have the anecdotal experiences and the stories, but as well as having the data and the statistics to back it all up, because the percentages are obscene. 77% of bullying, like that, I don't know any other work environment, and I mean, to be fair, I haven't researched it, that can boast that kind of a number when it comes to workplace emotional violence. I mean, it's a psychological darkness in nursing. And agents of chaos are often these managers. And again, I'm not saying that all nurse managers are toxic, but in long-term care in particular, the ones that are not don't last. They either get thrown out the door by corporate themselves, or they just realize that they're up against a behemoth that they can't control, that is bigger than them, and they're not willing to sacrifice their morals or their ethics on certain positions, certain things, and that they may be fighting a losing battle. So many of them burn out. The expectations of management is really phenomenal in terms of their availability, their reachability. I mean, you're constantly having to be near a phone. You're expected to pick it up at all days and hours. I've even seen an Indeed job listing that says 24/7 availability, but you're not getting paid 24/7. And so when you break down the actual salary versus how much time is spent on the job or involved with the job, including going and doing assessments in another place, and the driving time and the gas and all of that, you're actually making less than a floor nurse in many cases. So the money's not even worth it. The glory is not even worth it. The glory of saying, oh, I have this acronym next to my name. I'm the DON. I'm the ADON. I know an ADON that she has to constantly put ADON next to her name, as if anybody cares, but she clearly does. And I'm not saying don't be proud of your achievements or, be proud of your leadership abilities, but that's not indicative of that, because she's very inept in her position. She's not a, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. I'm getting tired. She's just not good at what she does. She's not a good manager, basically. I was trying to sound a little bit more fancy in that assessment, but yeah, she's not effective. Effective management is what I should say. And ironically, she wants me to quit. Maybe because I keep pointing that out about her. So, yeah, that's okay. Anyway, I'm going to leave you guys with this. I'm going to do a part 2. In the meantime, if you can relate, I'm very sorry. But please feel free to like and share. And, just know that you're not alone. There are ways of dealing with it that don't necessarily mean that you have to up and leave your job. But I do encourage that if it is super toxic, there are some places that are way less toxic than others. And I have had the blessing to work in a couple of environments that were not as messy and that you could barely feel the messiness. So with that being said, I hope you have a blessed day. Thank you for tuning in, and stay tuned for next week where we continue toxic management. Thank you again.